So, Mr. Speaker, I first want to speak about the citizenship by descent, why it's problematic and why we will vote against. So, for some background, how did we get here? Well, prior to 2009, it was possible for Canadian citizens to pass on their citizenship to endless generations born outside of Canada. You didn't have to have much of a connection to Canada. You could never live in Canada, but yet you could pass on that citizenship over and over, generation after generation. And something happened in the mid-2000s, and it was a crisis in Lebanon. And many Lebanese Canadians were concerned about the safety and situation going on in Beirut, and so they made sure that they had passed their citizenship on to their children. And when things got really, really difficult in Beirut, they called on the Canadian government to rescue them. And so the Canadian government spent, in 2006, the Canadian government spent $94 million bringing about 15,000 Lebanese Canadians to Canada. Now, these were Canadian citizens, but for the most part had rarely or never lived in Canada. And so these people benefited from citizenship with minimal connection to Canada, and they became known as the Canadians of convenience. And interestingly, what happened was a lot of these people were rescued from Beirut. They came to Canada for a bit, and many of them returned right back to Lebanon, and that was it for their connection to Canada. But it cost us Canadian taxpayers $94 million. And this led to a bill by the Harper government to create what was known as the first generation rule. So after 2009, the rule changed so that a citizen born outside of Canada could pass their citizenship to their child born outside of Canada for one generation, but the next generation born outside of Canada was not automatically a citizen. And that was called the first generation limit, and this bill now effectively abolishes that rule and allows people to transfer or confer citizenship on their children generation after generation after generation for one measly requirement of spending 1,095 days in Canada, which I'll talk about a little bit more. All you have to do to meet the requirements is have a few years in Canada. So why are we doing this now? Well, in 2023, the Ontario Superior Court ruled that this first generation law or rule was unconstitutional. So the Liberal government, in their great wisdom, chose not to appeal it, but to just accept it, to accept that ruling. They could have appealed it to a higher court, and they chose not to, and they committed to changing the law. The court did say, though, that it was reasonable to apply a substantial connection test. They understood you can't just give citizenship out like candy. There has to be some sort of a connection to Canada. And so they said, if you put in some sort of a substantial connection test, that would be okay according to the law. So this Liberal government chose to create a substantial connection test that is not substantial at all. This test, it's 1,095 days, which is about 3 years. You have to spend that much time in Canada prior to the birth of a child. It's not consecutive days. It could be a month here, a month there. And 3 years is very weak. It is, the government doesn't even know, really, if you've been in Canada for that time. It's an affidavit that a person signs. So it's a very weak way to commit to being a Canadian citizen and then to confer that citizenship onto your children. It's not a real test of commitment because those days don't have to be consecutive. The other issue in this is that there's no criminal background check at all. And so once again, we could be passing on citizenship to children who potentially could have serious convictions, they could have serious criminal background, but yet we wouldn't even know because we don't even check. Even though when we have newcomers coming to our country, the government puts a lot of effort into checking the security background of those people, and it can take up to a year or longer for newcomers to actually get processed through security. So Andrew Griffith from Policy Options said, to remedy the issue, Bill C-71, speaking about the previous legislation, uses residency as a substantial connection test. However, the new standard in Bill C-71, which requires a foreign-born Canadian to have spent a total of 1,095 days in Canada, differs significantly from what is required of new Canadians. The government has failed to fully consider the implications of such an open-ended condition. And I might note, Mr. Speaker, that in the U.S., you can only confer citizenship to the first generation, and you have to have at least 5 years in the U.S., with 2 of those years being after the age of 14. There's also very strict screening. In the UK, it's only the first generation that can be admitted into Canada. So there are some very strict rules in our partner countries that the Liberal government here has chosen not to enforce, creating this extremely weak connection test. Which brings up a question. What does it mean to be a citizen? And I believe this bill cheapens that. There's an organization called the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. They do great work on this subject of citizenship, and they help a lot of newcomers in our country. And Daniel Bernhard, who's the CEO, said this: "The sense of belonging is very powerful. If people don't consider Canada to be their society, then they won't dedicate themselves to it or get involved in our culture and contribute their utmost to making our society a success." That's the danger of concern to all of us. We must roll up our sleeves to restore the value of being Canadian. So citizenship is a connection to your home country. It's being there for your country in times that are good and bad. You know, it's enjoying the peace of Canada. It's proudly participating in wars when necessary, being available for keeping the peace at other times. Also, you need to understand the current situation in our country. You need to live here to understand how things are. You know, some of the issues we have right now in our country with crime, with an epidemic of crime, with expensive and unavailable housing, with difficulties in healthcare, trying to find doctors and waiting lists, with high taxes. We have a drug crisis, including fentanyl in our country right now. And you don't know that if you're living in another country. It's also important to understand our history and be proud of our accomplishments. Be proud of our sports teams. Even though some people may cheer for sports teams outside of Canada, nobody does that, right? But we need to be proud of our teams, proud of the beauty that's in our country. Believing in our Canadian values and norms, democracy, equality, not engaging in religious squabbles and wars. You know, so many people come to our country from other countries, and they bring their culture, they bring their food, they bring all the good parts of their countries, and it's often they are escaping bad situations. They're escaping war, they're escaping fighting, and we don't need to bring those wars to Canada. We can bring the good parts of it and build a country and a society that works for us here. And people that come here enjoy our social safety net. But it's so important that you participate by paying taxes to enjoy that social safety net. It's something that Canada is proud of. We take great care of our people, but there's a cost to that. And it's very unfair when people who have never had any participation in our tax system then expect to receive benefits from that.
This bill, and this is what I think happened. So you have an incompetent minister who has to deal with this issue. There was a court ruling that the government chose not to appeal, and it needed to address somehow. But rather than take an approach proposed by a Conservative member from the other place, which had a tight, narrowly defined solution that would have addressed the court ruling, they teamed up with a far left, now independent member of this place, to utterly gut that bill and extend Canadian citizenship, turning it almost into like a low-grade frequent flyer program through this bill, okay? It's basically like, you have to scan once every 5 years and you get your loyalty program. That's really what this bill is. So a competent minister would have taken all stakeholder concerns, said, okay, for the few people that the Lost Canadian ruling applied to, let's have a tight, narrow, defined bill to address that. That's what she should have done. She should have listened to the stakeholder feedback in endless debate in the previous Immigration Committee and fixed the bill, such that it could have been something that could have been passed through this House. But instead, you know what she did? I don't even think she read the bill, to be honest with you. I think she probably took a memorandum to Cabinet with whatever the department gave to her and said, just table the same thing. And that's what she did. I bet you if we had the ability to question her at length here, she could not go through the provisions of this bill. And to me, that's not responsible government, given the impact of this bill. So let's talk about what it does, because I think it's really important for Canadians. And I know that they're like the colleagues opposite in the Liberal Party that they've been putting up for debate today, you can tell by their answers that they don't understand what the bill does either. And they're just going to blindly vote for it without thinking through the enormous, nonpartisan concerns that this bill creates for the value of Canadian citizenship. So, essentially what this bill does is it eliminates something called the first generation limit. And this was a provision that was put in place by a previous Conservative government to put restrictions around how Canadians' citizenship can be automatically passed down to people who do not live in Canada anymore, for the most part. That's essentially what, and this, for colleagues who want a little history lesson, this was precipitated by a situation that happened roughly 15 years ago, during the conflict in Lebanon, where there were what we would refer to as Canadians of convenience, people who had no substantive ties to the country, who all of a sudden claimed Canadian citizenship so that the government of Canada would be obligated to evacuate them. That initiative in 2006 cost, at that time, the Canadian taxpayer almost $100 million, plus endless other ancillary benefits. And most of these people, the vast majority, had no ties to Canada at all. And then most of them left and went back almost immediately thereafter. So it raised serious questions. I know it's tough to talk about conflict, but we have to talk about in this place what the obligations of the government of Canada are to people who do not have substantive ties to Canada, but then claim citizenship. To be clear to anybody watching this, I am not talking about the small number of people that the first generation limit that was imposed affected. This is why a Conservative member from the other place did the job of the government for them in the last Parliament and tabled a private member's bill to close that loophole. We support those provisions. It's why a Conservative member put them forward, who was in the right place. But again, a now independent member who lost party status in the last election worked with the government to completely gut that bill and turn it into a chain migration bill. And that's what we have here today. And that's not right. We need to have a conversation in this country about the responsibilities of Canadian citizenship. The minister started her speech with those words. There are rights and responsibilities to Canadian citizenship. Her speech was entirely about the rights and failed on the responsibilities. And that is why the Liberal approach to immigration has been so broken. As they keep talking about, you think about, even on a macro level, the Liberals, you'll remember the mantra of the last decade was Canada's a post-national state with no identity. Well, if we're a post-national state with no identity, what does Canadian citizenship mean? And if we're tabling bills that that allow people with no substantial connection to Canada to ad nauseum, forever and ever, pass on citizenship with no ties to this country, that denigrates every person, including people who have immigrated to Canada and become citizens and started businesses in here, worked as healthcare workers, have paid taxes, have become part of our Canadian pluralism. It denigrates all of our citizenship. It denigrates all of our identity. And to me, that, the beauty of our country, of course, is our pluralism. And it has saddened me as a Canadian to watch people across the country, Liberal, Conservative, NDP alike, lose faith in the value of immigration to Canada. But again, it's because the Liberal government have focused entirely on some sort of false, broken understanding of the rights of Canadian citizenship and has done nothing about the responsibilities. So let's talk about the responsibilities. In this bill, there is absolutely no requirement for somebody to consecutively live in Canada in order to receive Canadian citizenship. Practically what this bill does is, let's say somebody living abroad who somewhere up their ancestry chain, because this bill would make it like great-great-great-great-great-grandma in the future, whatever, somewhere up their citizenship or their family tree, somebody had Canadian citizenship. They could just say, okay, sometime over their entire life period, they would only need to spend slightly over 1,000 days in Canada. It could be over 70 years, it could be over 80 years. And sometime, not consecutively, they just need to spend, that amount of time in Canada. Then they get Canadian citizenship. Now, practically, because we have to start talking about the rights that these people would then obtain, they would be able to do what? Get access to the Canadian healthcare system. And because Canada right now doesn't have any obligation, even for countries that have tax treaties, so I'm not talking about double taxation here, for people to file taxes when they have a citizenship situation like that, they wouldn't have any obligation to, in their responsibilities as Canadian citizenship, to pay for those services. That's the way this bill is written right now. That's what it functionally means. So while people, the part of the problem of this place, sometimes, Speaker, is that people, they have to think about what this bill would mean in 10, 15, 20, 25 years, right? Now, let's talk about how many people this could impact. In debate today, over and over and over again, Conservative colleagues have brought up the fact that in the last Parliament, for months, we tried to find out how many people this could impact. This broad, now independent member, formerly NDP, lost massively in the last election because of policies like this, bill would support. So here's the thing. And, I'm being heckled. They're saying, well, they're not in government. Well, they're not in, the NDP aren't in government, but I don't know why the Liberals would just support their bill. It's completely strange. But anyway, what this bill would do is, we don't know how many people this affects. The government could not say, okay, over a 10, 20, 30-year period, how many people would be able to draw health care benefits in Canada, draw the services of our country, right? They couldn't, and so we asked the parliamentary budget officer. His best guess, and again, he was kind of stonewalled in his analysis on the government, because I don't think they want the public to know this.
That's right.
Because I think they know how many people this could impact. I think that my colleague earlier said that there's about 4 million people currently living abroad that have Canadian citizenship, so then you start thinking about the exponential downstream impact this bill would have. He said at a minimum it's going to be 100,000 people over 5 years, at a minimum. That's his best guess. Why would the Liberals propose a bill that would essentially allow mass chain migration to this country through automatic Canadian citizenship without any sort of substantive tie to the country? It really does speak to motive. Why are they doing this? They could have just kept the Conservative bill with a minimal scope, but no, they did this on purpose, and they've now done it twice. Instead of making amendments to the bill as were required, they've now done this twice.